of the stories from the Hebrew Bible, jumping from story to try to get some of the grand sweep of that ancient narrative. So we read the story of Noah's Ark and the rainbow promise, the covenant that God made with all creation. That's one of our ancient creation myths. And then we met Abram and Sarai, who would become Abraham and Sarah, the parents of a great nation. And while they were childless at the time that God promised them they would be the parents of a great nation, they did, in fact, have a child. And that child grew up and had other children. And they spread across the land, and eventually they found their way to Egypt. And all went well for a generation or two in Egypt, but then we are told at the beginning of the book of Exodus that a new Pharaoh took power in the land, and that Pharaoh did not trust the Israelite people, and so turned against them and finally enslaved them. And it was while they were enslaved that God appeared again, this time to a man named Moses, and said, "Moses, I've got a job for you to do. I need you to go down to Egypt and set my people free." And Moses said, "No, thank you." And God said, "Moses, I've got a job for you. I need you to go down to Egypt and set my people free." And Moses said, "But I stutter." And God said, "Moses," and finally Moses said, "Okay," and down he went, and it took some doing, but eventually he did set those captives free. They left the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said, "Fine, go, stop bugging me," and they fled for their lives. Only then Pharaoh changed his mind and sent an entire army after him, and after all of the fleeing Israelites. Here's what happens next.
This is a reading from Exodus. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, "What have we done, letting Israel leave our service?" So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them and against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left.